It began on a night so ordinary that no one in Villisca could have imagined what the dawn would bring. The town was quiet, a small Iowa farming community of barely 2,000 souls, its streets dim under gaslight and the occasional lantern swinging on a porch. June 9, 1912, a Sunday. Church bells had rung that morning, hymns had drifted through the open windows of the Presbyterian church, and the townspeople had gone about their routines with a comforting rhythm. By twilight, the air was heavy with the scent of cut grass and coal smoke. Children ran barefoot through yards, fireflies glimmered above the fences, and the whistle of the evening train echoed across the cornfields. No one noticed the figure that watched the Moore house from a distance, a shadow blending with the darkening horizon, patient, waiting. Inside the small white-painted home on 2nd Street, Josiah Moore was locking the back door. He was 43, a quiet, respected man who ran a John Deere dealership downtown. His wife, Sarah, 39, was gathering hymn books and church leaflets. That evening, the family had attended the Children's Day service at their church, a bright, lively event where their kids had performed recitations and songs. Their 4 children, Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5, had been giddy with exhaustion when they returned home. 2 neighbor girls, Lena and Ine Stillinger, ages 12 and 8, had come to stay the night after the service. It was a common kindness in a small town, a sleepover between friends. No one knew it would be their last. The clock struck 9:30. Lamps were turned low. Laughter faded into whispers, then silence. Sarah folded her hands in prayer beside the bed. Outside, somewhere beyond the fence line, a soft crunch of gravel sounded, footsteps too deliberate to belong to a stray dog or wandering drunk. And then nothing. Hours passed. The night deepened. The moon crept over the slanted roof of the Moore home, silvering the windows. In that strange hour between midnight and dawn, a faint creak sounded from the attic, the sound of wood settling or perhaps someone moving. Whoever was there had been waiting. Police would later believe the killer had entered the house before the family returned, slipping through an unlocked door and hidden in the attic or closet until everyone was asleep. Sometime after midnight, he descended the narrow stairway, carrying Josiah's axe. The first blow landed on Josiah's head as he slept beside his wife. It was quick, brutal, silent, except for the dull thud of iron against bone. Sarah never woke. The murderer struck again and again until the room was slick with blood, until the ceiling bore the marks of his swings, arcs of crimson that would horrify investigators in the morning. He moved methodically through the house, sparing no one. Each child was struck as they slept, their faces peaceful until the final instant. Then he crossed the hall to the Stillinger girls. Some accounts say one of them may have awakened, may have seen his face, a fleeting glimpse of the figure who ended her life. By 4 a.m. the killer's work was done, 8 lives extinguished. The house was still again, but he did not flee immediately. He lingered. He covered the mirrors with clothing and sheets, a ritual or a superstition perhaps, to keep from seeing what he'd done. He drew the blinds, folded the victims' arms neatly across their chests. He even placed a piece of bacon wrapped in cloth beside one of the victims, as though acting out some private symbolism only he understood. In the dawn's gray light, Villisca stirred. Roosters crowed. The train whistle blew. Neighbors began their morning chores. Nothing seemed amiss until around 8 a.m. when Mary Peckham, the Moores' elderly neighbor, noticed the house was unusually quiet. No children's voices, no movement, no smoke from the chimney. She waited a while, then crossed the yard and knocked on the door. Silence. She tried the handle, locked. She went around back, peered into the windows. The curtains were drawn tight. Uneasy, she fetched Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who had keys. Ross arrived, calling out as he approached. Still nothing. He unlocked the door and stepped into the parlor. The air inside was heavy, close, thick with an odor that made him stop short. He took one step further, then another, and saw 2 small shapes beneath a sheet on the floor. He lifted a corner and stumbled back, pale. "Something awful happened," he muttered, stumbling out into the yard. "Call the marshal." When Marshal Hank Horton arrived minutes later, he entered the house and found the bodies. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The rooms were dim, flies already buzzed in the corners. The first bedroom held Josiah and Sarah, unrecognizable. The bedposts and ceiling spattered with dark stains. In the other rooms, the children lay side by side under white sheets. The axe was propped against the wall, wiped but still smeared with hair and tissue. Word spread like wildfire through Villisca. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered outside the house, neighbors, townsfolk, reporters. Some wept, others whispered in horror. A few, unable to resist morbid curiosity, slipped inside before authorities could stop them, trampling potential evidence. By the time the county coroner arrived, the crime scene had already been compromised. The front lawn was trampled, fingerprints smeared, but the horror was unmistakable. Investigators pieced together the likely sequence. The killer started in the master bedroom, then the children's, then the guest room where the Stillinger sisters slept. He covered mirrors, covered the faces of the dead, and stayed long enough to eat leftover food from the kitchen. On the table, he left a bowl of bloody water, perhaps used to wash his hands. No one in Villisca could comprehend such evil. The Moors had been respected, church-going people. There were no enemies anyone knew of, no theft, no apparent motive. That night, as Sheriff Jackson ordered guards to keep sightseers away, the sun set over a town changed forever. Men stood in knots along Main Street, talking in low voices. Mothers kept their children indoors. Every door was bolted, every shotgun loaded. The following days brought fear like Villisca had never known. Trains were searched, strangers questioned. Bloodhounds were brought in, noses to the ground, tracing faint scents across fields before losing the trail. The dogs led deputies to a nearby creek, then back toward the edge of town, and then nothing. The killer had vanished. Rumors sprouted faster than corn in the fields. Some said a traveling preacher had done it. Others whispered of a jealous rival or a deranged transient from the freight yards. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Reporters from Des Moines and Chicago descended on the town, scribbling in notebooks, sketching the house, interviewing anyone who would speak. The Moore home became a macabre tourist attraction, its white siding turning gray under the press of onlookers. In the parlor, Coroner Lindquist took notes by lantern light, his hands trembling slightly as he described the positions of the bodies. The more he saw, the less sense it made. The killer had used the blunt end of the axe on most victims, an odd, deliberate choice, and covered their heads after death. The precision suggested not rage, but something colder. At the funeral, coffins lined the church aisle, 8 in all. The entire town attended. The pastor's voice broke as he spoke of innocence lost, of evil walking among them. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed. Outside, hundreds stood silently as the bells tolled 8 times. Afterward, Villisca was never the same. Nights were tense. Men took turns keeping watch. Women prayed in their parlors. Rumors continued that a drifter seen near the train depot had blood on his shirt, that someone spotted footprints near the Moore fence line, that strange lights were seen in the woods. Weeks passed and investigators pursued leads that went nowhere. Theories multiplied: revenge, robbery, madness, ritual, but nothing fit neatly. No fingerprints, no eyewitness, no confession. Just a town haunted by the thought that the killer could be one of their own. And somewhere out there, whoever had done it, whoever had crept through that house in the darkest hours of June 9, was still free. The morning after the funerals, Villisca woke under a sky the color of lead. The fields lay silent, the birds subdued as if even nature was holding its breath. The smell of fresh earth from the cemetery still clung to the air. In the town square, black ribbons fluttered on storefront doors. Marshal Horton hadn't slept in 2 nights. He stood on the courthouse steps, rubbing the bridge of his nose, staring out at the growing crowd of townspeople demanding answers. The newspapers had called it the Axe Murders at Villisca. a phrase that would stain the town's name for a century to come. Behind closed doors, the sheriff and his deputies argued over leads. They had questioned drifters, preachers, ex-employees of Josiah Moore's implement store, but the evidence was thin as smoke. The only weapon was the axe itself, a household tool belonging to Josiah, and no fingerprints were usable. Then came the letters. Reporters began receiving anonymous notes claiming to know who the killer was. One said it was a jealous husband. Another swore it was a traveling minister named Reverend Kelly. The sheriff collected them all, though most were written in shaky hands or childish scrawls. The Moore home had become a crime scene that no one wanted to enter, yet no one could stay away from. Deputies tried to keep gawkers out, but the curious slipped through anyway, sometimes at night. One man swore he saw a candle flickering in the upstairs window long after the house was empty. Another said he heard footsteps in the attic, the same place where the killer was thought to have hidden. In the press, the story grew with every retelling. The Des Moines Register called it a massacre of biblical proportions. Papers as far away as New York and Chicago ran illustrations of the Moore home, dramatizing the story into legend before the blood had even dried. Detectives from the Burns Agency arrived from Kansas City, men in dark suits and derby hats, promising to bring modern methods to Iowa justice. They studied the crime scene with magnifying glasses and measuring tapes, then left with little more than the sheriff already knew. The killer had struck with precision, showing neither haste nor panic. Weeks turned into months. Summer fields turned gold, and the hum of the harvest mixed with the whisper of rumors. Villisca was no longer the quiet farming town it had been. Trust had eroded. Neighbors eyed each other warily over picket fences. Children were kept indoors after dusk. Doors that had never known a lock were now bolted tight. The first major suspect was a man named Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and state senator. Jones had once employed Josiah Moore at his hardware store, but their relationship soured after Moore left to open his own competing dealership and took a lucrative John Deere contract with him. People whispered that Jones had never forgiven him, that there had been bad blood, resentment, jealousy. Some said Jones hired someone to settle the score. Investigators looked into it. They found that on the night of the murders, Jones was home with his family. His alibi was sound. But rumors rarely need proof. They only need oxygen. In Villisca, that rumor burned like fire. Then came the stranger sightings. A drifter named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, was arrested months later in another state for murdering his mother and grandmother with an axe. The similarities were chilling. He had used the blunt end just as in Villisca. He covered the bodies. He even wiped the weapon clean. Detectives wondered if they had found their man, but there was no evidence linking him directly to Villisca. The timing didn't quite fit, and though newspapers loudly speculated, the case went cold again. Meanwhile, Reverend George Kelly, the traveling minister who had attended the Children's Day service the night before the murders, emerged as a figure of fascination. Kelly was peculiar, small, wiry, with a nervous twitch and a tendency to talk too much. He was known for peering through windows, for sending strange letters to parishioners. Witnesses recalled that he had left Villisca on the morning train, just hours after the bodies were found. Days later, he returned, uninvited, to attend the funerals. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, authorities finally arrested him. They had found a letter he'd written to investigators, describing details of the crime not released to the public. Under questioning, he confessed, then recanted, then confessed again. He told them he'd heard a voice from God commanding him to slay utterly. He spoke of the Moore house, of blood, of shadows moving in the dark. But when his trial began, his story fell apart. His lawyers argued he was mentally unstable, prone to hallucinations. The jury deliberated for hours and returned a verdict of not guilty. Villisca sighed, defeated. There would be no justice. By the 1920s, the murders had passed into grim folklore. The Moore house, boarded and silent, stood like a ghost on 2nd Street. Grass grew tall around its fence. Children dared each other to peer through its windows at night, swearing they saw faces or heard crying inside. The townspeople spoke of curses and hauntings. Some claimed they could hear the faint ring of the church bell that had sounded that fateful Sunday night. Others said they saw a lantern flicker in the upstairs window when the wind was still. But beneath the superstition lay something more real, a wound that never healed. The murders had shattered the illusion of safety, leaving a scar that stretched across generations. Years later, a retired deputy who had worked the case in his youth sat in his kitchen telling a young reporter, "It wasn't just a man who killed that family, it was something darker, something that took its time, that stayed in that house and listened to them breathe before it struck." The reporter asked if he believed the killer had known the Moores. The old man paused, staring into his coffee. "I think he watched them," he said softly. "I think he knew when they laughed, when they prayed, when they slept. He wanted them quiet." As the decades rolled on, every few years brought new theories. Some claimed it was a railroad worker passing through. Others insisted it was a serial killer who struck in multiple towns across the Midwest, using the same method, the same weapon, the same ritual of covering faces and mirrors. Indeed, other murders occurred in nearby states during that era: Paola, Kansas; Ellsworth, Kansas; Colorado Springs. Whole families bludgeoned in their beds, victims struck with the blunt end of an axe, mirrors covered afterward. No money stolen, no motive. Could it have been the same man? Many investigators thought so. They called him the Midwest Axeman, but his name, if he had one, never surfaced. By the 1930s, the Villisca house had changed owners many times. Most stayed only briefly. Tenants complained of sleepless nights, of whispers on the stairs, of dreams filled with footsteps and the echo of a child's cry. One man swore he awoke to see a figure standing at the foot of his bed, hatchet in hand, watching. Even skeptics felt uneasy there. The place seemed to breathe the memory of violence, as if the walls themselves remembered. Yet through all the theories and confessions, all the headlines and ghost stories, one truth remained unbroken: the murders were never solved. The town that once stood as a quiet farming community became a byword for terror, its name whispered alongside Borden, Hinterkaifeck, and Lawson. But the story didn't end there. Because even decades later, when crime historians dug into the records, something curious emerged: patterns that hinted the Villisca killings might not have been unique. In at least 7 towns between 1911 and 1914, families were murdered in nearly identical ways, by an unknown killer who vanished without a trace each time. The same type of axe, the same covering of windows and faces, the same nighttime ritual. Coincidence or something more? No one could say for certain, but for those who still lived in Villisca, those old enough to remember the day the Moore family was buried, it didn't matter. The evil that came through their town had never truly left. Even now, as the years piled on and the fields grew over the old paths, the Moore house still stood, a pale, silent witness to what happened on that June night. Its floorboards creaked with every shift of wind, its walls whispering stories no living soul could tell. And when the night was still and the moon hung low over the cornfields, some swore they could still hear it: the faint scrape of an axe being dragged across the floorboards just before dawn. The house on 2nd Street stands empty now, the paint peeled by Iowa winters, the front porch sagging with age. More than a century has passed, but the night of June 9, 1912 still lingers in its walls like a scent that never fades. People cross the street rather than walk past it after dark. They say the air there feels thicker, as if time itself slows down within its boundaries. In the years after the murders, Villisca tried to heal. New families moved in. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story whispered by parents who swore never to speak of it openly. Yet every generation returned to the same unanswered questions. Who crept down those stairs with an axe in hand? Why cover mirrors? Why linger to wash up in the kitchen sink? Why take nothing? Detectives who revisited the case decades later sifted through brittle paper files and faded photographs. The evidence boxes smelled of mildew, their labels curling at the edges. Inside were scraps of humanity. The coroner's notes describing the terrible mutilation, strands of hair wrapped in paper, a rusted key, an envelope marked simply blood samples, more residents. One investigator, a state historian named Edgar Vaughn, became obsessed with connecting the Villisca murders to a chain of similar killings that rippled through the Midwest between 1911 and 1914. He spread maps across his desk, pinning red dots across Iowa, Kansas, Illinois, and Colorado. Each dot marked a family slaughtered in their sleep. He saw the pattern immediately, always near a railroad line, always at night, always with an axe found at the scene, faces covered, windows draped, no barking dogs, no witnesses. In Colorado Springs, two families, the Burnhams and the Waynes, had been killed the same way only months before Villisca. In Ellsworth, Kansas and Paola, Kansas, the same signature appeared. Vaughn called it the rail line of blood. If his theory was right, the killer could have ridden the rails, slipping into small towns at night, disembarking near the edge of town where the whistle faded into the prairie wind. He would watch, wait, strike, and vanish before sunrise, gone with the next freight train east. Newspapers at the time hinted at such a traveler, a tall, thin man seen near depots, sometimes carrying a small valise or Bible. He introduced himself as a preacher. Other times he asked for work sharpening tools. None remembered his name. Vaughn believed the Villisca killer was the same phantom. The Midwest Axeman, he called him, a man who murdered not for money, but for the ritual of it, the quiet domination of a sleeping house. His theory gained traction among criminologists, even inspiring later writers who compared it to early patterns of itinerant serial killers long before the term existed. But proof remained elusive. No fingerprints, no photographs, no living witnesses. By the mid-century, the case files gathered dust again. The sheriff who once swore he'd find the killer was long buried, his notes yellowed to the color of bone. Villisca itself shrank as the highway bypassed it, its once bustling main street reduced to a handful of storefronts and a faded water tower. Then came the era of curiosity seekers. In the 1970s and 80s, journalists rediscovered the story. True crime magazines ran lurid features with headlines like Night of the Hatchet and The Evil That Slept in Villisca. Tourists arrived to gawk at the old house. Some wanted history, others wanted a brush with the supernatural. The house had changed owners several times. Some restored it, others abandoned it again. Those who tried to live there rarely lasted. They reported strange sounds, the faint giggle of a child echoing through empty rooms, footsteps packing in the attic where the killer may have hidden, doors opening though latched tight. One couple said the smell of kerosene would suddenly fill the air at night, the same scent neighbors remembered drifting from the house the morning of the murders. Another tenant described waking to find small handprints on the wall above her bed, smudged in something dark that wasn't dust. Skeptics dismissed it as imagination fueled by notoriety, but for locals, the story was never just legend. The descendants of the victims still lived nearby. For them, it was a wound, reopened each time a journalist or ghost hunter came to town with cameras and questions. In 1994, the house was purchased by Darwin Lynn, a local farmer and history enthusiast. He decided to restore it exactly as it had been in 1912, down to the wallpaper patterns and gas lamp fixtures. He reopened it as the Villisca Axe Murder House, offering tour to those who dared to step inside. Reporters noted that even in daylight the interior felt uncanny. The rooms were small, airless. The upstairs hallway seemed to press inward. The children's bedroom was furnished with replicas of their tiny iron beds. On one wall, faint stains were still visible beneath a century of paint. Visitors spoke in whispers as if afraid to disturb the silence. Guides told the story methodically: the church service, the sleepover, the midnight slaughter. Then they pointed to the attic, explaining how investigators believed the killer waited there, crouched in the heat, listening to laughter drift up from below. Some nights the house hosted overnight stays for researchers and paranormal investigators. They set up cameras, recorders, EMF meters. More than one left before dawn, pale and trembling. A few captured faint voices on tape, a woman humming, a child calling "Mama." Whether real or imagined, those sounds carried the echo of something unresolved. The sense that the story was still happening, looping endlessly through the hours between midnight and dawn. Even outside the realm of the supernatural, the case continued to fascinate criminologists. In 2000, a retired FBI profiler reviewed the evidence. His conclusion: the killer was likely a transient who had killed before and after Villisca, driven by compulsion rather than revenge. He estimated the man's age between 25 and 35, intelligent, socially isolated, perhaps suffering from religious delusions. The profiler's notes were chillingly specific. Subject remains in the house post-offense, exhibiting ritualistic behaviors, displays control and lack of panic, likely enjoys revisiting the scene mentally. If alive, he would have reread newspaper accounts obsessively. But by then, whoever he was long dead. Justice was never coming. Still, the town could never quite let go. Each anniversary drew crowds to the small cemetery where the Moore family lay side by side. Locals left flowers, toys, sometimes axes carved from wood. Ministers prayed for peace over ground that never seemed to rest. And always, the house watched over them from its hill. In 2014, more than a century after the murders, tragedy struck again. A paranormal investigator spending the night there was found bleeding from a self-inflicted stab wound, though he could not later explain why he had done it. He survived, but told reporters he felt overwhelmed by something evil in the moments before. The story renewed the house's notoriety. Television crews arrived. Documentaries aired on cable channels. Historians shook their heads at the sensationalism, but admitted the house had a power few places possessed, the power of unanswered questions. Because at the heart of the Villisca mystery lies not just violence but silence, the blank space where motive should be. If it had been greed, jealousy, or revenge, the story would have ended in 1912 with a name in a courtroom. But the absence of motive is what keeps it alive. The idea that a stranger could step from the darkness into an ordinary home, erase a family, and disappear again, that is what haunts us. Late at night, when the prairie wind sighs through the corn, old-timers in Villisca say you can hear the faint echo of that long-ago train whistle. They say that if you stand near the tracks and close your eyes, you can almost feel the ground tremble beneath your feet, as if something unseen is passing by again. In the end, the house endures as both museum and memorial. Visitors leave hushed, stepping into the sunlight blinking, as though surfacing from a dream. Some swear they hear a child's laughter behind them. Others feel only a deep, aching sadness. The guide locks the door, the key turning with a soft click. The windows reflect the fields, the sky, the ordinary world outside. Inside, the air settles once more into silence. No one will ever know the killer's name. His footsteps are long erased, his heartbeat long stopped. But in Villisca, time does not heal, it circles. The night of June 9, 1912 never really ended, it just repeats itself, in whispers and in memory forever. And somewhere in the hush before dawn, the house still waits. More than 100 years have passed since that night, but Villisca still whispers. The town has changed. Paved roads, convenience stores, streetlights glowing soft amber through the fog. But when the sun sinks behind the cornfields, the quiet feels the same as it must have on June 9, 1912. The cicadas fall silent, and for a moment every porch light flickers as if the air itself remembers. Each generation has tried to explain the horror in its own way. Historians trace the events through archives and testimony. Psychologists describe a killer consumed by impulse or faith-mad delusion. Ministers call it a test of good and evil. But when the storytellers finish speaking, the same unease hangs in the air, the sense that logic can't quite reach whatever passed through that house. Inside, the floors have been polished, but the boards still creak in the same places. During tour, guides tell visitors to listen closely. "It isn't ghosts you hear," one says softly. "It's memory." He means it both ways. The memory of 8 lives interrupted, and the memory we all carry of how fragile safety really is. Late in the evenings, the curator sometimes sits alone in the parlor after the last visitors leave. The oil lamp hums faintly, and shadows ripple across the wallpaper where sunlight once fell on children's drawings. He says he feels a pressure then, not fear exactly, but presence, as though the house is breathing beside him. Sometimes he whispers a good-night prayer before locking the door. Researchers still arrive with notebooks and recorders. They talk about motive, psychology, the patterns of itinerant killers in the early 20th century. One criminologist stands in the upstairs hall and sketches diagrams, tracing the killer's path step by step, imagining each motion, each breath. When he reaches the final doorway, the Stillinger girl's room, he stops. "You can't map what he was thinking," he says quietly. "There's a moment where reason ends." Outside, Villisca's cemetery slopes gently toward the river. The Moore family lies together beneath weathered stones. Every year on the anniversary, locals leave fresh flowers and small toy axes carved from wood, not out of morbid fascination but remembrance. The descendants still speak of them with tenderness. The laughter, the songs from the Children's Day service, the ordinary love that existed before the headlines. What keeps the story alive isn't simply the brutality, it's the mystery that refuses to close. The killer vanished into history like a stone into deep water, and yet the ripples never stopped widening. Each new generation rediscovers them. Filmmakers, historians, ghost hunters, readers, each trying to pull the truth from the dark. Sometimes, when the train passes through town after midnight, its whistle long and mournful, old residents wake briefly and think of the Axeman again. They imagine him stepping off that train in 1912, carrying nothing but a small case and a smile for anyone who noticed. He would have walked down the dirt road, past the gaslights, to the little white house at the end of 2nd Street. They wonder if he ever looked back. In that wondering lies the real haunting, not in spirits trapped within walls, but in the questions that have no answers. How can ordinary life stand so close to the edge of the unimaginable? How does evil pass unnoticed through a place as quiet as a sleeping town? And yet Villisca endures. The corn still rises every spring, the church bell still rings. Children ride their bikes past the old house and wave to tourists clustered on the sidewalk. Life moves forward, indifferent and forgiving. But at dusk, when the light turns red gold and the crickets start their slow rhythm, the past seems to lean closer, reminding everyone that forgetting is impossible.